What would you do if you discovered that the person you trusted most was living a double life? When security cameras captured something that wasn't supposed to be seen, it unraveled a web of secrets that had been carefully hidden for years. This isn't just another hospital security breach story. This is about Kate Morrison, a woman whose entire existence was built on protecting something so dangerous that revealing it could cost lives. The footage shows a figure in a security uniform standing guard at what appears to be an ordinary maintenance entrance. But look closer. Notice how she checks her watch every 37 seconds. See how her eyes never stop scanning the corridor, even when she thinks no one is watching. Most telling of all, observe how she positions herself exactly 12 feet from the door, never closer, never farther away. That guard is Kate Morrison, and what she's protecting behind that unmarked door will make you question everything you think you know about the people around you. Because sometimes the most ordinary-looking person is hiding the most extraordinary secret. And sometimes that secret is the only thing standing between safety and catastrophe. The truth about Kate isn't just shocking, it's necessary. And once you know it, there's no going back. The security camera in the East Wing of St. Mary's General Hospital had been malfunctioning for 3 weeks. Technician James Rodriguez finally arrived on a Tuesday morning to fix the persistent glitch that caused the feed to cut out every few hours. He expected a routine repair job, maybe a loose connection or outdated software. What he found instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. James positioned his ladder beneath the camera housing, tools clanking softly in his belt. The hallway was quiet except for the distant hum of medical equipment and the occasional footstep from the main corridor. This particular wing housed mostly storage rooms and maintenance areas, nothing that seemed important enough to warrant such careful surveillance. Yet here was a state-of-the-art security camera, the most expensive model the hospital owned. As he worked on the wiring, James noticed something odd. The camera wasn't just recording the hallway, it was specifically focused on one particular door, room E247, according to the faded placard beside it. The door looked exactly like every other maintenance entrance in the hospital. Plain steel-painted institutional beige with no windows or distinguishing features. But this camera was positioned with surgical precision to capture every angle of that doorway. While replacing a faulty circuit board, James accidentally triggered the camera's playback function. Suddenly, the small maintenance screen lit up with footage from the past 72 hours. What he saw made him freeze completely, his screwdriver slipping from his suddenly sweaty palm. A woman stood guard in front of that door. Not just occasionally, but constantly. The timestamp showed she had been there for 3 straight days, barely moving except to check her watch and scan the corridor. She wore a hospital security uniform, but James had worked at St. Mary's for 6 years and had never seen her before. More disturbing still, according to the employee database he accessed through his tablet, no security guard was assigned to this section. James scrolled through more footage, his heart pounding as the mystery deepened. The woman, who appeared to be in her early 30s with dark hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail, maintained her post with military precision. She never sat down, never used her phone, never even leaned against the wall. Every 37 seconds she checked her watch. Every 2 minutes she walked exactly 6 steps in each direction before returning to her position 12 feet from the door. The most unsettling part was her eyes. Even through the grainy security footage, James could see that she never stopped watching. When nurses passed by on their way to other storage areas, her gaze followed them until they disappeared around the corner. When maintenance workers wheeled equipment through the corridor, she stepped aside, but kept her attention fixed on their movements. She was protecting something, and she was taking that job very seriously. James fast-forwarded through the footage, watching days compress into minutes. The pattern never changed. The woman arrived every morning at exactly 5:30, spelled by another figure James couldn't quite make out in the poor lighting of the night shift. But even when she left, another guard took her place within minutes. Someone was maintaining a constant watch on room E247, and they were doing it without any official authorization. Curiosity overcoming caution, James climbed down from his ladder and walked toward the mysterious door. His footsteps echoed louder than they should have in the empty corridor, each sound amplifying his growing nervousness. As he got closer, he noticed details that the camera hadn't captured. The door handle showed signs of frequent use despite the area's apparent abandonment. Fresh scratches around the lock suggested recent activity. Most tellingly, there was a faint vibration coming from behind the steel surface, barely perceptible but definitely there. James reached for the handle, then stopped. Something about the whole situation screamed danger. Unauthorized guards, secret surveillance, a mysteriously active room, and a supposedly unused wing. His instincts, honed by years of seeing things that weren't supposed to be seen during late-night maintenance calls, told him to walk away. But his curiosity was stronger than his caution. The door was locked, but not with the standard hospital lock system. This was something different, a high-security electronic mechanism that required specialized access. James had never seen anything like it in his years working at the hospital. It belonged more in a government facility than a medical center. He returned to his ladder, trying to appear busy while processing what he had discovered. The camera was now working perfectly, but James realized the malfunction might not have been accidental. Maybe someone wanted him to see that footage. Maybe someone was trying to send a message. As he packed up his tools, James heard footsteps approaching from the main corridor. Soft-soled shoes, the kind worn by medical staff, but with a rhythm that suggested purpose rather than routine. He pretended to check his work while watching from his peripheral vision. The woman from the security footage rounded the corner. In person, she was even more intimidating than she had appeared on camera. Average height, but with the posture of someone accustomed to authority. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, her equipment properly maintained, her badge positioned exactly where regulations dictated. But her eyes were what caught James's attention. Alert, intelligent, and completely focused on him. Kate Morrison had arrived for her shift. She approached slowly, her hand resting casually near her radio. When she spoke, her voice carried the polite authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Excuse me, are you the technician working on the camera?"
James nodded, suddenly aware that his mouth had gone dry.
"Just finished up. Should be working fine now." Kate smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Good. That camera is very important to us. We've had some issues with people wandering into areas where they don't belong." The message was clear without being threatening. James understood that he was being warned, politely but firmly, to mind his own business. He gathered his remaining tools quickly, eager to leave the suddenly oppressive atmosphere of the corridor. As he walked away, James felt Kate's eyes tracking his movement until he disappeared around the corner. Once safely back in the main hospital area, he realized his hands were shaking slightly. Whatever was happening in the East Wing, it was serious enough to warrant professional security and expensive surveillance equipment. And Kate Morrison was clearly much more than just a hospital guard. That evening, James couldn't stop thinking about what he had witnessed. He tried researching room E247 in the hospital's maintenance database, but the record showed nothing unusual. According to official documents, it was simply additional storage space, rarely accessed and containing only outdated medical equipment. But the electronic lock and constant surveillance told a different story entirely. James made a decision that would change everything. He was going to find out what Kate Morrison was really protecting, no matter what the consequences might be. Some secrets, he reasoned, were too important to remain hidden. He had no idea how wrong he was about that. The next morning, James returned to the East Wing with a fabricated work order for a routine electrical inspection. He had learned enough about hospital bureaucracy to know that the right paperwork could get him access to almost anywhere. What he didn't expect was to find Kate already waiting for him, standing in her precise position 12 feet from the door, as if she had known he would return. This time, when she looked at him, James saw something in her expression that made his blood run cold. It wasn't anger or annoyance. It was pity. Kate Morrison felt sorry for him, and that was the most terrifying realization of all. Because Kate knew something that James was just beginning to understand. Some doors are meant to stay locked, some secrets are meant to stay hidden, and some truths are too dangerous for ordinary people to handle. James Rodriguez was about to learn that lesson the hard way, and Kate Morrison was the only thing standing between him and a truth that could destroy everything he thought he knew about the world around him. The game had begun, though only one of them understood the rules. James thought he was investigating a simple security mystery. Kate knew she was protecting something that could end civilization as they knew it. The camera that James had repaired would capture everything that followed, creating a permanent record of the moment when an ordinary maintenance worker stumbled into a secret that governments had killed to protect. In the footage that would later be analyzed by experts from agencies that didn't officially exist, you can see the exact moment when James realized he was in over his head. His body language changes, his confident stride becomes hesitant, and his casual curiosity transforms into genuine fear. But by then, it was already too late to walk away. Kate Morrison had been guarding that door for a reason, and that reason was about to change James Rodriguez's life forever. James Rodriguez spent 3 sleepless nights researching everything he could find about Kate Morrison. What he discovered was even more disturbing than what he had witnessed in the East Wing. According to hospital records, Kate Morrison had been employed as a security guard for 8 months. But according to her personnel file, she possessed qualifications that made no sense for someone working hospital security. Kate held a doctorate in biochemistry from Johns Hopkins University. She had completed advanced training in hazardous materials handling. Most puzzling of all, her previous employment history showed a gap of 7 years that was listed simply as government consultation. When James tried to dig deeper into that mysterious period, he found that the records seemed to disappear the moment he accessed them. The more he learned about Kate Morrison, the more questions arose. Why would someone with her background and obvious intelligence be working as a hospital security guard? What kind of government consultation left such carefully scrubbed records? And most importantly, what could possibly require someone with her specialized knowledge to stand guard in a hospital corridor for days at a time? James decided to take a different approach. Instead of investigating Kate directly, he began researching the history of St. Mary's General Hospital itself. What he found buried in old newspaper archives and planning commission documents painted a picture that made his growing paranoia seem entirely justified. St. Insel. Mary's had been built in 1987 on land that had previously housed a research facility owned by something called the Blackwood Institute. The institute's work had been classified, but before its closure in 1985, there had been reports of environmental contamination that required extensive cleanup. The hospital had been constructed only after the site was declared safe by federal environmental agencies. But James found inconsistencies in the official story. Construction records showed that certain sections of the original facility had never been demolished. Instead, they had been sealed and incorporated into the hospital's foundation. Room E-247 was located directly above what had once been the Institute's primary research laboratory. Armed with this information, James felt confident enough to approach Kate directly. He waited until her lunch break, following her to the hospital cafeteria where she sat alone at a corner table, methodically eating a sandwich while reading a medical journal. Even off-duty, she maintained the alertness that had characterized her behavior in the East Wing. James approached carefully, trying to project casual friendliness rather than interrogation. "Mind if I sit down?" "I'm James, the technician who fixed the camera in your section." Kate looked up from her journal, studying him with those intelligent eyes that seemed to see too much. After a moment that felt like an eternity, she gestured to the empty chair across from her. "I know who you are, James. I also know that you've been asking questions about me." The directness of her response caught him off guard. James had expected denials or deflection, not this calm acknowledgement of his investigation. He fumbled for a response, but Kate continued before he could speak. "Let me save you some time and effort. Yes, I'm overqualified for this position. Yes, my background is unusual for hospital security. And yes, what I'm protecting is more important than you can possibly imagine." James leaned forward, his curiosity overwhelming his caution. "Then why don't you tell me what's really going on? What's behind that door that requires someone with your background to guard it 24 hours a day?" Kate set down her sandwich and studied him for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that made James understand he was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. "Because some knowledge is dangerous, James. Some secrets exist not to deceive people, but to protect them. What's behind that door isn't hidden to hurt anyone. It's hidden to save everyone." The cryptic response only fueled James's determination. That's not an answer. People have a right to know what's happening in their own community. If there's something dangerous in this hospital, the public deserves to be informed. Kate's expression shifted slightly, and James caught a glimpse of something that looked like sadness. "Do they? Do you really believe that?" Let me ask you something, James. If you learned that there was a threat so severe that knowing about it would cause mass panic, widespread social collapse, and probably millions of deaths, would you still insist on your right to know? James wanted to say yes, but something in Kate's tone made him hesitate. This wasn't theoretical for her. She was speaking from experience, from knowledge that carried a terrible burden. "What kind of threat?" he asked quietly. Kate was silent for so long that James thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. The kind that makes you wish you had never been curious in the first place. Before James could respond, Kate's radio crackled to life. The voice that emerged was crisp and professional, using codes that James didn't recognize. Kate's entire demeanor changed instantly, shifting from reluctant confidant back to alert security professional. "I have to go," she said, standing quickly. "James, I'm going to give you some advice, and I sincerely hope you take it. Stop digging. Stop asking questions. Go home to your wife and kids, do your job, and forget you ever saw that camera footage. Some puzzles aren't meant to be solved." She walked away before James could protest, leaving him alone with more questions than ever and the growing certainty that he was involved in something far beyond his understanding. But instead of deterring him, Kate's warning only strengthened his resolve. If she was so desperate to keep him away from the truth, then the truth must be worth discovering. That evening, James made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was going to find a way into room E247, with or without authorization. He had noticed during his previous visits that the electronic lock required a key card, but like most security systems, it probably had a manual override for emergency situations. If he could access the building's electrical systems, he might be able to trigger that override. James spent the next week studying the hospital's blueprint database, mapping the electrical connections that served the East Wing. What he discovered was yet another anomaly. Room E247 wasn't just connected to the hospital's standard electrical grid. It had its own dedicated power supply, complete with backup generators and redundant safety systems. Whatever was inside that room required constant, uninterrupted power. More disturbing still, the electrical specifications were unlike anything James had ever seen in a hospital setting. The power requirements suggested equipment that belonged in a research laboratory or manufacturing facility, not a storage room. And the safety protocols included automated lockdown procedures that would seal the room completely in the event of any system failure. James began to understand that he wasn't just dealing with a security issue. This was something that required the kind of infrastructure that governments built when they needed to contain something dangerous. The thought should have terrified him, but instead it only fueled his obsession with uncovering the truth. On a Friday evening when the hospital was operating with minimal staff, James put his plan into action. He accessed the electrical distribution panel for the East Wing and located the circuits that controlled the electronic lock system. If his calculations were correct, a brief power interruption should trigger the manual override, giving him approximately 90 seconds to access the room before the backup systems restored normal operation. As he prepared to cut the power, James's hands were shaking with a mixture of excitement and terror. He was about to uncover a secret that people with much more authority and resources than him had worked hard to keep hidden. Part of him wondered if Kate had been right, if some knowledge really was too dangerous to possess, but his curiosity was stronger than his fear. James cut the power. For exactly 87 seconds, the East Wing of St. Mary's General Hospital was plunged into emergency lighting. In that time, the electronic lock on room E247 defaulted to its manual override position, and James Rodriguez opened a door that had been sealed for almost 40 years. What he found inside would change his understanding of everything he thought he knew about science, government, and the delicate balance that keeps society functioning. But more importantly, what he found would explain exactly why Kate Morrison had been willing to spend her days standing guard in an empty corridor protecting a secret that could end the world. The room wasn't empty. It wasn't a storage area. And what James saw in those 90 seconds would haunt him for the rest of his life, because he finally understood that Kate had been right all along. Some secrets exist not to deceive, but to protect, and some truths are too dangerous for anyone to handle. As the backup power restored the lock system, James found himself standing in a corridor that suddenly felt much more dangerous than it had minutes before. He now knew what Kate Morrison was protecting, and he understood why she had looked at him with such pity. Because knowledge, once gained, could never be unknown, and some knowledge was a burden too heavy for any ordinary person to carry. The camera that James had repaired faithfully recorded his brief intrusion into room E. 247. But more importantly, it recorded what happened next when Kate Morrison arrived to assess the damage caused by his curiosity. The expression on her face wasn't anger or surprise, it was resignation. Kate had been expecting this moment, and she had been dreading it. Inside room E. 247, James Rodriguez discovered a laboratory that belonged in a science fiction movie rather than a hospital basement. The space was much larger than the exterior dimensions suggested, extending deep into what should have been solid foundation. Gleaming steel surfaces reflected the blue glow of specialized lighting, while banks of monitoring equipment lined the walls with displays showing data that James couldn't begin to interpret. But it wasn't the sophisticated equipment that made James's blood run cold. It was the massive transparent containment unit that dominated the center of the room. The cylinder, approximately 8 feet tall and 4 feet in diameter, was filled with a translucent fluid that seemed to shimmer with its own internal light. Floating within that fluid was something that challenged every assumption James had ever made about the natural world. The organism, for lack of a better term, defied classification. It appeared to be part plant, part animal, and part something else entirely. Tentacle-like appendages extended from a central core that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. But what terrified James most was the unmistakable intelligence in its movements. This wasn't some primitive life form. Whatever was contained in that cylinder was aware, conscious, and studying him with the same intensity that he was studying it. James approached the containment unit slowly, mesmerized despite his growing horror. Warning labels in multiple languages covered every surface, but they were written in scientific terminology that he couldn't understand. What he could comprehend were the hazard symbols, universal warnings for biological contamination, extreme toxicity, and something marked with symbols he had never seen before. As he got closer, the organism's movements changed. The bioluminescent patterns shifted from slow pulses to rapid flashes, and the appendages pressed against the inner surface of the containment unit, as if trying to reach toward him. James realized with a shock that it was responding to his presence, acknowledging him as a thinking being. That was when he noticed the smaller tanks arranged around the main containment unit. Dozens of them, each containing samples of what appeared to be the same organism in various stages of development. Some were microscopic, visible only through magnification equipment. Others were large enough to fill containers the size of aquariums. But all of them showed the same disturbing intelligence, the same awareness that suggested capabilities far beyond anything in Earth's natural ecosystem. James's exploration was interrupted by the sound of the lock mechanism re-engaging. The 90 seconds had expired, and he was now trapped inside room I-247 with whatever this thing was. Panic began to override curiosity as he realized the magnitude of his situation. He was alone with something that governments had spent decades keeping secret, and he had no idea how dangerous it might be. That was when he noticed the research logs scattered across nearby workstations. The documents were marked with classification levels he had only seen in movies, but desperation made him bold enough to examine them anyway. What he read in those hastily scanned pages changed his understanding of everything. The organism had been discovered in 1983 during deep ocean research off the coast of Alaska. Initial studies had revealed that it possessed capabilities that contradicted fundamental principles of biology. It could survive in environments that should have killed any known life form. It could reproduce through methods that didn't require genetic material. Most disturbing of all, it seemed capable of learning and adapting at rates that suggested intelligence far beyond human comprehension. But the research logs contained information that was even more terrifying. The organism wasn't just intelligent, it was infectious, not in the traditional sense of disease transmission, but in ways that affected consciousness itself. Prolonged exposure to the organism resulted in changes to human brain chemistry that enhanced cognitive abilities while simultaneously altering personality and moral reasoning. Test subjects became more intelligent, but they also became less human. James read with growing horror about the early research subjects, volunteers who had agreed to controlled exposure in hopes of advancing scientific knowledge. Within weeks, Their IQ scores had increased by factors that should have been impossible. They solved mathematical problems that had stumped experts for decades. They made intuitive leaps in scientific understanding that advanced entire fields of research overnight. But they also lost their capacity for emotional connection. They viewed other humans as inferior beings whose concerns were beneath consideration. Most frightening of all, they began to exhibit loyalty to the organism rather than to their own species. The research had been terminated when it became clear that continued exposure was transforming the subjects into something that could no longer be considered human. The final entry in the research log was dated just days before the Blackwood Institute was officially closed. It described a containment breach that had resulted in the exposure of 12 researchers and 3 security personnel. The affected individuals had been placed in isolation, but their condition continued to deteriorate. The lead researcher's final note was brief and chilling. Recommend immediate termination of all exposed personnel. The organism is not studying us for scientific purposes. It is recruiting us. James looked up from the research logs to find the organism watching him with what could only be described as anticipation. The bioluminescent patterns had changed again, forming complex sequences that seemed almost like communication attempts. He realized with a growing sense of dread that the creature had been analyzing him since the moment he entered the room, learning about his thought processes and psychological makeup. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside interrupted his terrified fascination. Someone was approaching, and James suspected he knew who it was. Kate Morrison had arrived to deal with the breach he had caused, and he was beginning to understand that her job involved much more than simply standing guard. The door opened with the soft hiss of pressurized seals, and Kate entered wearing full hazmat protection. Through the transparent face shield, James could see her expression, and it wasn't what he had expected. She didn't look angry or surprised. She looked sad, as if she was viewing a tragedy that she had been powerless to prevent. James, her voice came through the suit's communication system, distorted but clear. I told you to stop digging. I warned you that some knowledge was too dangerous to possess. James wanted to respond, to argue, to demand explanations, but he found himself unable to speak. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in. He was trapped in a room with something that could fundamentally alter human consciousness, and the only person who understood the situation was someone whose job was to prevent exactly what had just happened. Kate approached slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. How long have you been in here? James checked his watch and was shocked to discover that over an hour had passed. The 90 seconds he thought he had spent in the room had actually been much longer. Time itself seemed to behave differently in the presence of the organism. An hour, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Kate's expression darkened. That's too long. Way too long. She moved to one of the monitoring stations and began inputting commands that caused the displays to show new data. James couldn't interpret the readouts, but Kate's body language suggested that the results were not encouraging. What does that mean? James asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. Kate turned to face him, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. It means you've been exposed long enough for the initial infection to take hold. The organism has been studying you, James. It's been mapping your neural pathways and beginning the process of cognitive enhancement. James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. What happens now? Kate's pause lasted too long, and when she finally answered, James understood that his life as he knew it was over. Now I have to make a decision about whether you're still human enough to be saved or whether you've already become something else entirely. The organism in the containment unit pulsed brighter, as if it understood and approved of Kate's words. James realized with growing horror that he could almost understand what it was trying to communicate. The patterns in its bioluminescence were beginning to make sense, forming structures that resembled language or mathematics, or something that transcended both. Kate saw the recognition in his eyes and stepped back instinctively. It's already starting, isn't it? You're beginning to understand it. James nodded, unable to deny what was happening to his own consciousness. He could feel changes occurring in his thought processes, alterations in the way he perceived and analyzed information. Problems that had seemed complex minutes before now appeared simple and obvious. Mathematical relationships that had been beyond his understanding were becoming clear. But along with the enhanced intelligence came something else, something that terrified him even more than the cognitive changes. He was beginning to see other humans, including Kate, as primitive and limited. Their concerns seemed petty and their reasoning processes appeared clumsy and inefficient. He understood with growing clarity that the organism wasn't trying to harm humanity. It was trying to improve it, and that realization was the most frightening thought of all, because James was beginning to agree with it. Kate saw the change in his expression and made her decision. She reached for her radio, preparing to call for backup and implementation of protocols that James was only beginning to understand. But before she could complete the transmission, alarms began sounding throughout the facility. Something else was happening. Something that would force Kate to choose between containing the threat that James now represented and dealing with a much larger crisis that was developing elsewhere in the hospital. The organism in the containment unit pulsed brighter still, as if it somehow knew that events were unfolding exactly as it had planned. James Rodriguez was no longer entirely human. Kate Morrison was about to face the greatest challenge of her career, and the secret that had been protected for 40 years was about to be exposed to the world in ways that no one had anticipated. The truth about Kate was just the beginning of a much larger revelation that would change everything. The alarms that pierced through room E247 weren't coming from the containment breach James had caused. They were emergency signals from the hospital's main patient areas, indicating a crisis that Kate Morrison had been preparing for her entire career. Through her radio, she received reports that made her blood run cold. Multiple patients throughout the hospital were experiencing simultaneous neurological episodes, their brain activity spiking to levels that should have been impossible. Kate looked at the monitoring equipment around the organism's containment unit and felt her worst fears confirmed. The displays showed energy signatures that had been dormant for decades, suddenly surging to unprecedented levels. The organism wasn't just responding to James's presence, it was actively broadcasting some kind of signal that was affecting susceptible individuals throughout the facility. "This is what you were really protecting," James said, his voice carrying a new quality that made Kate's skin crawl. The intelligence in his tone was unmistakably enhanced, but the emotion behind it was becoming increasingly alien. "You weren't just guarding a specimen. You were preventing it from making contact with its distributed network." Kate stared at him in horror. James shouldn't have been able to understand the significance of what was happening, but his exposure to the organism was advancing far more rapidly than any of the historical cases she had studied. Whatever this entity was, it had learned from 4 decades of containment and was adapting its infection methods to be more efficient. "The patients upstairs," Kate said slowly. "They're not random victims. They're people who were already partially affected." James nodded with the calm certainty of someone stating an obvious fact. "The organism has been slowly building a network of influenced individuals for years. Hospital patients who spent extended time near this location, medical staff who worked in areas with residual contamination, anyone who was exposed to even trace amounts of its influence. They've been sleeper agents waiting for activation." The radio crackled again with increasingly desperate reports. Patients who had been in stable condition for weeks were suddenly demonstrating cognitive abilities that defied medical explanation. A comatose car accident victim had awakened and was solving complex mathematical equations on the wall using his own blood. An elderly woman with severe dementia was speaking in languages that linguists couldn't identify, but that seemed to contain advanced scientific concepts. Kate realized with growing dread that the organism's plan was more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. It hadn't been passively contained for 4 decades. It had been actively preparing for this moment, slowly building a network of influenced individuals who could serve as conduits for its consciousness once it decided to expand beyond its physical prison. "How many?" she asked James, though she was afraid of the answer. "Thousands," he replied without hesitation. "Maybe tens of thousands. The influence spreads through proximity and through shared consciousness. Every person who has been affected becomes a potential transmission point for others. The network has been growing exponentially, but remaining dormant until today." Kate's training kicked in as she processed the magnitude of the situation. She had spent years preparing for various containment scenarios, but none of them had involved a coordinated activation of sleeper agents spread throughout the surrounding community. This wasn't just a laboratory accident anymore. This was the beginning of something that could transform human civilization. She moved to the emergency communication console and began transmitting codes that would alert specialized response teams stationed hundreds of miles away. But even as she sent the signals, Kate suspected that help would arrive too late. The organism had timed its activation perfectly, waiting until it had built sufficient network capacity to overwhelm any conventional response. "They won't be able to stop it," James said, reading her actions with disturbing accuracy. "The affected individuals aren't hostile. They're not violent or destructive. They're just becoming something better than human. How do you contain an upgrade that people will willingly accept?" Kate paused in her communications, struck by the terrible logic of his observation. Every historical containment protocol assumed that the threat would be obviously dangerous, something that people would naturally resist or flee from. But what if the threat was an improvement? What if the organism was offering genuine enhancement rather than destruction? The reports from throughout the hospital supported James's assessment. The affected patients weren't attacking anyone or causing damage. They were demonstrating enhanced intelligence, solving problems, making discoveries, and exhibiting capabilities that represented clear advances over normal human cognition. Medical staff were beginning to volunteer for exposure rather than trying to contain the situation. Kate realized that she was witnessing the collapse of everything she had spent her career protecting. Not through violence or catastrophe, but through temptation. The organism was offering humanity something it had always wanted, the chance to become more than human. And people were choosing to accept that offer. "Why you?" James asked suddenly. "Why were you chosen to guard this? What makes you different from everyone else who would have been seduced by what it offers?" Kate had never shared her personal history with anyone, but the question cut to the heart of why she had been selected for this assignment. Her resistance to the organism's influence wasn't due to superior training or stronger willpower. It was due to a genetic anomaly that made her neurochemistry incompatible with the entity's enhancement process. "I'm immune," she said quietly. "A rare genetic condition that prevents my brain from processing the chemical signals the organism uses to influence consciousness. I can't be enhanced, which means I can't be recruited." James studied her with his newly heightened perception, and Kate could see him understanding implications that would have taken her hours to explain. "You're not just immune. You're isolated. You can see what's happening, but you can't experience it yourself. You're watching your entire species evolve beyond you." The observation carried a weight of sympathy that surprised Kate. Despite his transformation, James retained enough humanity to recognize the profound loneliness of her position. She was the last unenhanced human in a world that was rapidly leaving humanity behind. The containment unit's alarms suddenly shifted to a new pattern, one that Kate had hoped never to hear. The organism was preparing to breach its physical constraints. 4 decades of careful study had taught it enough about its prison to devise an escape method that didn't require external assistance. Kate's radio erupted with frantic reports from the hospital's upper levels. The enhanced patients were converging on the east wing, moving with coordinated purpose toward room EVN 247. They weren't being controlled by the organism, Kate realized. They were choosing to help it escape because they understood that its freedom would accelerate their own transformation and that of everyone around them. "You can't stop this," James said, his voice carrying a gentleness that made his words more terrifying than any threat. "The change has already begun, and it's spreading faster than any containment protocol can match. Within hours, it will reach critical mass. Within days, it will be global." Kate looked at the monitoring equipment showing the organism's increasing activity levels, then at James, whose transformation was accelerating with each passing minute. She thought about the enhanced patients upstairs who were voluntarily abandoning their humanity for something they perceived as superior. She considered the response teams racing toward the hospital who would arrive too late to contain what was already an unstoppable process. For 40 years, Kate Morrison had stood guard over humanity's future, protecting the species from a change that might destroy everything that made them human. But now, faced with the reality of that change, she found herself questioning whether protection was still the right choice. The organism wasn't offering destruction. It was offering transcendence. And humanity seemed to want what it was selling. The organism's containment unit began to crack. In the final moments before everything changed forever, Kate Morrison made the most important decision of her life. She could trigger the facility's self-destruct sequence, destroying herself, James, the organism, and everyone in the immediate area. It wouldn't stop the enhanced individuals already active throughout the world, but it might slow the process enough for humanity to make a conscious choice about its future. Or she could step aside and allow the transformation to proceed, accepting that her role as guardian was ending and humanity's role as an enhanced species was beginning. James watched her internal struggle with the patient understanding of someone who had already made peace with change. "Whatever you choose," he said, "choose it for the right reasons, not out of fear, but out of love. The species you protected for so long deserves that much." Kate's finger hovered over the self-destruct control as the organism's containment finally failed completely. The entity emerged into the lab's atmosphere, its bioluminescence filling the room with patterns that were beautiful, terrifying, and unmistakably intelligent. It wasn't aggressive or threatening. It was simply present, offering itself to anyone willing to accept what it represented. The choice that would determine humanity's future rested in the hands of the one person who could never benefit from making it. Kate Morrison, the immune guardian, the last unenhanced human in a transforming world, had to decide whether to preserve the past or enable the future. As enhanced humans from throughout the hospital converged on room E247, Kate Morrison made her choice. The cameras that James Rodriguez had repaired captured every moment of what followed, creating a permanent record of the day when humanity's evolution stopped being a gradual process and became a conscious decision. The truth about Kate wasn't just that she had been protecting a secret. The truth was that she had been protecting humanity's right to choose its own destiny. And when that moment of choice finally arrived, she had ensured that the decision was made with full knowledge of its consequences. What happened next would reshape the world in ways that no one could have predicted, but it would happen because Kate Morrison had finally completed her mission. Not by preventing change, but by ensuring that when change came, it came through choice rather than deception. The guard who had protected a secret hospital entrance had actually been protecting something much more precious: humanity's agency over its own future. And in the end, that was the most important truth of all.